generous introduction. My mother would believe most of it. The rest of you can use some discretion. I was delighted and honored to receive this invitation to participate in this weekend's festival. I would go just about anywhere and do just about anything that Richard and Claudia invited me to do. I owe them more than I can express. I think Richard's tired of me gushing in gratitude for him, but I cannot miss an opportunity to say something about what he has done for me and what he has done for a generation, many generations of Latter-day Saint scholars. I simply would not have had the life or the career I've had if I had not encountered Richard Bushman 20 years ago. So I'm grateful to be part of something that he and Claudia and so many others care so deeply about this weekend. And I'm grateful to have a chance to reflect on art and the Latter-day Saint experience and art and religion generally. Art is a sidelight for me. I'm primarily an intellectual historian, but I'm increasingly drawn to artistic expression as a wonderful way to both teach and reflect on the ideational content of American religious culture. And so an opportunity like this helps sharpen my own analytical and reflective skills as I dive ever more deeply into the world of the arts. As Stake President, Richard mentioned my current calling as Stake President. And as Stake President, I get called on to speak quite regularly. And so much so that I sometimes have grown quite weary of the sound of my own voice. I can only guess at the fatigue faced by the faithful congregants who have to listen to me repeatedly. We just had stake conference last Saturday and Sunday, so it's fresh on my mind. Actually, I don't have to guess too much about the fatigue of my congregants, because some of them have been quite explicit in conveying to me reflections on their experience. And one of my favorite items of feedback came from this young man, Lars Anderson. Lars was 7 at the time of his comment on my speech making. And Lars is a remarkably bright, beautiful young Latter-day Saint with a shock of light blonde hair and cornflower blue eyes. He's unfailingly sincere and usually, in a way that I appreciate, bracingly candid. This particular occasion, after I'd sat down after being in the pulpit, Lars turned to his mother and said, "How come he always says he's going to be brief, but he never is? Does he even know what brief means?" Now, part of my message tonight is about the importance of taking seriously the hard truths and the challenging questions of the rising generation. So I feel a kind of moral obligation to take Lars's critique of my oratory style to heart. But I have to say here in a public setting that yes, I do know what brief means. As it turns out, it can mean a number of things. It actually can function in different parts of speech. It's a noun and a verb as well as an adjective. Regarding one of the nominal uses of the term, as Professor Daines and undoubtedly others in the room who are trained in law could explain, legal briefs can actually be quite lengthy. So take that, Lars. Just kidding. I love Lars very much. He's remarkable. He and his mother and his brothers recently moved from Massachusetts to the Bay Area in California, where Lars was just named Stanford Hospital's Autistic Hero for 2019. He and his family have helped me understand many things. And in a roundabout way, his reflection on my speaking styles got me thinking tonight about the nature of effective arguments and advocacy. Thinking about what it means to refine a case down to its most essential and persuasive elements. It's clear that the founders and the directors and the advisors, the lists of whose names include many of the people that I admire most in this church, understand how to make an argument in a direct and compelling way. From what I've seen and experienced, and got here a few hours ago and had a chance to experience the exhibits, they've submitted what seems to me an unanswerable brief on behalf of the intrinsic value of the creative work done by Latter-day Saints and of the importance to our community of supporting that work. They've made this case most compellingly simply by presenting the art itself. This is much more powerful than the many unartful words that I might employ and the large would predict I would employ in the defense of the center and the work that it supports. The art is its own best argument. I'd like to approach my role this evening in a similar spirit, not by wordy argument, but by offering my own experiential brief for the religious significance of art. The thesis of my experience tonight is that in my life, just as in the thinking, I shouldn't say just as, but similar to the thinking of early Americans, that art has the ability to play an essential integrative role between the doctrinal truths, the moral implications, and the effective experiences of religion. To put it another way, art is the site where we can simultaneously deepen and relate the content of our belief, the external implications of our belief, and the inner experience of our belief. Now, before people start to get nervous that I'm suggesting that art is a medium of doctrine, I'm using the term doctrine in a wonderfully expansive and capacious way that is, I think, in keeping with Latter-day Saint usage of the term. Before I get to the integrative implications of my encounters with art, and in vindication of Lars's skepticism, who would probably be shaking his head at this point, I need to do a rather lengthy bit of setup work tonight. Since I'm a historian by training and by disposition, I can't help but put all of this in a little bit of historical perspective. And as I'm a historian of the United States, let's start there. As the esteemed cultural historian Philip Gura has noted, much of the development of an American artistic tradition is inextricably linked to a theological and philosophical debate that raged from around the 1730s to roughly the 1850s. Gura largely credits the Calvinist preacher Jonathan Edwards, who gets credited and blamed for so much in American life, as both the chief symbol and perhaps the leading cause of a cultural turn in which profound affectional or emotional experience became not just an acceptable, but an essential part of a redemptive religious awakening. Of course, this was not entirely new, and this is sort of a broken record among historians who always recognize the antecedents to something that somebody claims is unprecedented. Edwards's Puritan forebears regularly wept over their sins and over their experiences of redemption. But the level of theological and philosophical attention to the matter of emotion unmistakably rose in Jonathan Edwards' generation. Emotions, or the passions, or the affections, as functions of the natural man, remember that the Nicene Creed indicated that God is without passions, had long been suspect in Western Christianity, and especially as the Reformation darkened the view of human depravity. But the faculty psychology, the 18th century faculty psychology is a kind of term of art describing a view of human nature which identified and isolated particular functions within human nature and tried to make sense of their role and their relationship to one another. Faculty psychology in the 18th century ran into a pretty intractable problem. The emotions were flighty and fickle and potentially quite dangerous and needed to be checked by the higher faculties of reason and prudence. But the emotions were also increasingly recognized as the great motivators of sincere human action. The higher faculties might be safer, but they are also more tepid, more restrained. They couldn't move people to do things, including especially difficult things that might require moral courage. The artwork of the period sometimes reflects great concern for the relationship of head and heart. This is Count Nicholas Zinzendorf, who was the founder of the Moravian Church. One of my favorite images from the 18th century Atlantic world. See the image of the pierced heart of the Savior, sending shafts of light both into Zinzendorf's heart and into his head as he preaches to a demographically diverse audience in a colonial setting. to great preoccupation artistically, theologically, culturally, with this relationship of head and heart, as some of you undoubtedly were. It was a preoccupation of none other than Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century. What do we do? What do we do with emotions that can be dangerous, but that are also the powerful force that drives us to the most meaningful action? In the 18th century, men and women in the Atlantic world experienced a series of revolutions: an evangelical revolution, a democratic revolution, market revolution, and a series of intellectual revolutions associated with those other changes. And in all of these, the questions of how to motivate human beings to heroic action incessantly came to the fore of the discourse. One of the great philosophical tasks of the period was to figure out how one might harness the positively motivating power of the passions while keeping them safely subject to the dictates of the rational mind. Distinctive traditions in American visual and literary arts were born in this period in which people were urgently attempting to ascertain the proper relationship of head and heart. And over that time, as views of human depravity gave way to humanity's more optimistic self-assessments, the human affections came to be seen as more and more trustworthy. Now, of course, there's a spectrum here. There are people who very much retained a Calvinist outlook in which human affections were inherently suspect, in fact, to be restrained by Scripture and other disciplining forces. On the other end of that spectrum, you have people like the transcendentalists who believe that human intuition ought to be given full sway, and restraint was the thing to be suspect, rather than the passions themselves. An evangelical emphasis on a palpable experience of rebirth increased, and a romantic cultural movement highlighted the epistemological value of intuitive feeling. The ideal between head and heart shifted repeatedly and along that continuum, with advocates and adversaries on either side of the argument. To use an anachronistic analogy, they saw emotion as the engine and the rational intellect as the steering and braking mechanisms. Emotion without reason was destined to crash, and with it, civilization. Reason without emotion would never get anywhere meaningful. Where the 18th century tended to place most of its emphasis on the importance of perfecting the steering and braking systems, the 19th century was more comfortable in souping up that engine, really making it red. But throughout, there was this sense that the well-lived Christian life required a healthy and functional relationship between the two. Truly moral lives were the promised result of such integration. In the 19th century, it became quite apparent to many observers, ranging from Emerson to Lincoln, that art had a distinctive capacity to affect this integration. Stand here before you to tell you, as a witness of my own experience, that I think they were right. They were certainly right in theory, however limited they may have been in their own aesthetic practice. This theological and philosophical quest for the proper balance of emotion and intellect fueled much of the era's artistic activity. Some of the period's finest artists, Herman Melville springs to mind, explicitly took on the Edwardian challenge to appeal simultaneously and effectively to emotion and to intellect. The apogee of such an artistic dream of integrating reason and the affections hit during the moral, political, and religious crisis over human slavery. In a setting where opponents of slavery wanted both to convince minds and harness the revolutionary power of motivated hearts, the integrative capacity of art made it an appealing avenue for abolitionism. Consider Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe was a direct legatee of the Edwardian tradition, and her novel made explicit political, economic, and biblical arguments against slavery, while also packing the heavy emotional punch of such scenes as a mother fleeing across a partially frozen Ohio River for the future of her child with a slave catcher, a team of slave catchers in hot pursuit. This is Eliza and little Harry Harris, major figures in Uncle Tom's Cabin. That scene, it has been argued by more than one scholar, probably did more than any number of rational abolitionist arguments for moving otherwise neutral citizens toward a position of anti-slavery. Or consider the paintings of Thomas Satterwhite Noble, some of my favorite I've included here. The first, in the upper left-hand corner, is an image of Margaret Garner, a depiction of a real-life experience in which a slave woman murdered her own son rather than have him sold to another plantation. The Price of Blood, in the lower right-hand corner, is one of the more familiar images, often makes it into textbooks of American history, depicting a slave owner selling his own mixed-race son, undoubtedly the product of a sexual assault, as sexual coercion was a recurring reality of plantation. You can't really, I regret that you can't really make it out in this reproduction of the image, but in the upper right-hand corner, there's actually a painting hanging on the wall. It's a painting of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, in a way that suggests that slavery was a reflection of an Old Testament thinking in which fathers sacrificed sons, and a condemnation in both religious and ethical registers of the patriarch in the foreground and the money he's receiving for his own offspring. Satterwhite Noble has a few others that are especially evocative. The Last Slave Sold is the title of the image in the upper left-hand corner, a mother holding her baby with her associates, including children, dejectedly at the base of the auctioneer's stand. And then the Blessing of John Brown, as a mother presents her child to the martyr John Brown just prior to his execution. Abolitionist art was explicitly intended to bring hearts and minds into a cooperative relationship in pursuit of a profoundly moral reform. It's interesting to note that they believed art could do this in a way that nonfiction could not. After all, the story of Eliza Harris and baby Harry crossing the partially frozen Ohio was based on a true 1838 episode of a mother and her baby crossing the partially frozen Ohio River. But that true event did not move hearts and minds in unison in the same way as Stowe's literary account did, which empowered readers to identify with the mother in such a profound way. You could spend the rest of the evening talking about why that was, but it was. Indeed, as a historian, I'm a bit troubled to acknowledge that it did so in a way that even the non-fictionalized stories of the inhumanity of slavery could not. Now, scholars, post-bellum, have not been able to agree on whether books like Uncle Tom's Cabin or the art of Thomas Satterwhite Noble's anti-slavery images constitute great art, precisely because they seem too transparent in the didactic and sentimental objectives that they set out. They're trying too hard to change minds, too hard to move hearts, argue many scholars, and their overly conspicuous intent comes at an aesthetic price. Indeed, even the language of headed art, indeed, even the concepts of faculty psychology became increasingly passé in the post-bellum period. Even as I sometimes argue for the artistic merits of Stowe and Noble, I concede that the mid-19th century vision of art as the integrator of intellect and emotion in the cause of a more moral life could produce some pretty lousy work. More often than not, the Noble dream tended toward a gag-inducing mix of heavy-handed moralizing and manipulative sentimentality. The often mediocre art generated by the quest to speak to head and heart generated a certain kind of rebellion of the sort exemplified by the Hudson River school painter George Innes's image Winter's Evening is depicted here, part of a group of painters that include the likes of Thomas Cole, whose artwork graces the cover of my first book. Innes declared, later in the 19th century, the purpose of the painter is to simply reproduce in other minds the impression which a scene has made upon him. A work of art does not, and implicitly should not, appeal to the intellect. It does not appeal to the moral sense. Its aim is not to instruct, not to edify, but simply to awaken emotion, close quote. For those who had to live with the ham-fisted preachiness of so much antebellum art, a stand like Innes's must have come as sweet relief. Enough with the instruction. Enough with the integration. The post-Bellum cultural shift away from sentimentality and toward realism and then naturalism was seen as powerful steps in the direction that Innes had called for. A description of art as not necessarily appealing to the rational intellect, not aiming to instruct. This growing conviction, a conviction that I would suggest is growing to this very day, is that art had nothing to do with anything so stultifying, so constraining, so oppressive as doctrine. This movement led to the production of works like Theodore Dreiser's turn-of-the-century Sister Carrie, which was both scandal and sensation for its refusal to draw a moral from the story. But contra Innes and much of modern artistic criticism, I would contend that great art is often still playing an integrating role between the conscious intellect and the visceral emotions, even when it actively attempts to abdicate that role. Note the lesson that Sister Carrie itself draws from Carrie's early marriage to her first husband, her would understand there's problems with that marriage, is not legal. He's a bigamist. But a man who mistook his wife's silence for satisfaction. The narrator comments that Carrie's husband should not have been so quick to make assumptions about her taciturn nature before he had really thought through her view on things. The narrator states, quote, Hirschwood was pleased with her placid manner when he should have duly considered her. Even in Dreiser, there is a powerful should, a call to a better way. There's marriage advice, even in Sister Carrie. There is, in fact, even in the naturalism of Dreiser, an unmistakable integrative process going on. Art that claims to be doing nothing more than observing the world as it actually is making an argument to our minds for the importance of viewing the world as it actually is, and often for empathy for the fallen human beings that we find occupying it. And it is frequently making claims on hearts and heads in ways that force the intellect and the affections to come to terms with one another. Now, in suggesting that art is often a medium of doctrine, I don't mean doctrine in that didactic 19th century sense of the term. I mean doctrine in the Latter-day Saint sense of the term. Doctrine is an expression of the way things were, the way things are, the way things should be, the way things could be. Doctrine as the embodiment of truth in all of its complexity and from all of its sources. I know that my talk of head and hearts can seem a little bit outdated, oversimplified. Faculty psychology was a vestige of a long ago time. But I have to admit that my own experiential encounter with art suggests something of the value in retaining some of that language of 19th century criticism. With acknowledgments to Lars Anderson, that is my long setup to my own brief on the experience of art. In my adolescence, I lived in the United Kingdom, feeling some guilt for dragging me across the ocean in the middle of what would have been my high school years. My parents worked assiduously to show me the virtues of European living. My first full summer in England, they gifted me with a Euro-rail train pass, and I spent a couple of weeks rumbling across the continent, sleeping on trains and existing on baguettes and cheese with my college-age sister and her new husband. It was a remarkable experience for me, but one moment in particular stands out in my memories above all the others. To avoid paying even the relatively low rate for hostel rooms, we made otherwise irrational travel decisions so that we were on long train stretches in the nighttime, crisscrossing from northern to southern Europe each evening, usually arriving in the new town in the early hours of the morning. Our second to last stop was Rome, and we decided to head to Vatican City early before the crowds had started to build. When the doors to St. Peter's Basilica finally opened, I walked with a relatively small group of people, passing through the atrium and into the nave. It was impressive, to be sure, but I'd seen large buildings before. The scale meant relatively little to me. I then turned to my right, I can picture this so vividly, and began making my way toward a statue that was illuminated in the far corner. I saw in that statue an overwhelming vision of the interplay of earthly affection and divine love, global significance and familial intimacy, the human cost of high calling. All these things sang to me from what had once been a slab of stone. In the moment, the reality of the atonement of Jesus Christ hit me in a way it had never done before. For all my appreciation of diligent Sunday school teachers and seminary curriculum, this was something new. It was not simply an emotional response, a cliche. At least it was not only that, it was probably a lot of that. But there was theology in that marvel for me. I was both dumbstruck and deepened as I was pinned to that spot, and I stood there for a long, long time, overwhelmed by the haunting serenity of the mother's face, by the pained and contorted look of a crucified king. One of the things that struck me most particularly was the manifest weight of the Savior's body on his mother's lap. I remember being struck by that bulge of flesh here in the stone between the rib cage and the shoulder, where her right arm is sustaining what is clearly a matter of some mass and reality, her crucified son. When I finally broke from my enthrallment, I purchased a photograph of the statue, protected it on the night's bumpy ride from Italy to Calais, and carried it to my home in the Midlands of England, hanging it on my wall above my bed in the place where football players had once graced my room. I'd become in some small way a different person, different not just in the way I felt about the atonement, but different in the way I thought about the atonement. When I learned that Michelangelo was only a few years older than I was when he used a hammer and chisel to release the power of the Passion, it only added to that impact. It was the first time in my life that I came to understand that spiritual elevation can occur at the confluence of heart and mind, at the confluence of religious devotion and artistic genius. It was an emotional moment. It was a doctrinal moment as well. The power of a work like the Pietà, and indeed so many of the best works of religious art, is that they exist along the boundaries of the veil, revealing both the reality of the human experience and the depth of divine meaning. And in the process, our conception of both sides of that veil are expanded. And please don't misunderstand me as suggesting that great art has to explicitly engage religious themes. I recognize that's not the remit of the center, and that's not what many of you do. But in this case, in the case of an expressly devotional bit of art, I had something that changed my life forever. I thought of the Pietà again this week as I reflected on the heartrending photograph of a young father and his daughter, crushed by the humanitarian tragedy that is this nation's southern border, and the economic inequalities of this world that fuel the merciless engine of human migration. As I saw that photograph of parent and child, arms and clothes intertwined, having died in the name of hope, I remembered my experience of the Pietà, of a Lord and his earthly mother who identifies with families on the move, migrants running from oppression, who ultimately also face death in an quest for hope. That emotional response and its intellectual companion deepened when my teenage self stood in the chapel of St. Peter's Basilica, refuses to let my middle-aged self become hardened to the bombardment of images of inhumanity that characterize our news cycles. Just as the encounter with the statue marked a moment of theological significance for me, it also marked the birth of a moral imperative, an integration of doctrinal truth, moral motivation, and affectional experience. It's interesting to me that beginning with that moment at the Vatican, my most evocative experiences with art have had to do with depictions of parent-child relationships. This thematic fixation has persisted for me up to the present day, with the capacity to strike an emotional chord that few other themes can hit, and stimulate charged thinking in a way that few other arguments can. I would include in this the remarkable photography that's coming out of the humanitarian crisis, to which I just alluded. That has certainly proven true in my reading habits, especially when I think about the sorts of titles over which I have a tendency to weep and about which I have a tendency to reflect repeatedly. I'm not much of a crier, actually. I was trying to recall the other day when in recent years I've had a real cry. In this millennium, I can only think of 5 occasions, pretty pathetic that I can count them, when I've had a really body-shaking, heart-rending, sob-expressing, tear-flowing cry. All 5 were sparked by books. One was the Book of Mormon, when a convergence of my own personal circumstances and the book's narrative, in this case, a scene in which Alma and Amulek had suffered in prison and faced personal assault and the trauma of witnessing the martyrdom of many, including children, when they stood upon their feet to put an end to abuse and evil. And reading that verse, I began weeping like a child, staining the pages of the Book of Mormon with tears. The other 4 examples come from literary fiction. I cried that way at the end of Leif Anger's piece Like a River. I cried that way at the end of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And I cried that way at the end of Marilyn Robinson's Home. And I confess that while reading to my children a series that I had been through a number of times with different kids, I cried that way at the end of Harry Potter. Most recently, I nearly wept at the end of George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. But that book, for all of its virtues, did not quite hit the same resonant frequency. It generated a tear or two, but it was ultimately a thinner experience than the one provided by those other texts. Among other things, Saunders' book lacked the rather conspicuous Christological elements that informed those other books. There was just as much pathos, but less of the effort to integrate that with something that even in my capacious definition would qualify as doctrine. I should note that in that regard, there's one other text that pretty well guaranteed to turn on my waterboards, namely Pearl S. Buck's short story, Christmas Day in the Morning, the tale we faithfully read with my children every December. Now, as I keep listening to these texts, I know I'm giving off the impression that I'm rather free with such sobbings, but the amazing thing in my mind is that I am absolutely not. In fact, I am so much not that I occasionally wonder if there's something wrong with me. I don't cry at funerals or weddings or graduations. I have parents that weep quite easily. I have children that weep quite easily. Somehow, for some reason, I don't. When people I love deeply come to me with horrific problems and terrible losses, of which life has its plentiful share, my irresistible and often regrettable instinct is not to weep, to simply mourn with those that mourn, but to roll up my sleeves and start working for a solution, or at least wrestle for words of comfort. But I don't cry much at all. But somehow, for some reason, literary texts do to me what nothing else seems to do. Maybe it's precisely because I don't feel like I have to help fix the pain and longing of literary characters, that I can mourn there with those that mourn more completely than I seem able to do in real life. Now, we could have a psychoanalytical field day with my emotional profile, no doubt, and some of you have undoubtedly already started trying. But I'm not sure that my experience is that unusual. When art finds its target, the effective shock waves can have an impact that few other modes of expression or experience can. But these are not purely emotional experiences for me. This is my point. This is my thesis. In each of the cases I cite, I realize that the books I have mentioned have caused me to think about the atonement of Jesus Christ in deepened ways. There is an integrative moment when lasting doctrine and acute affection intertwine, and I am left weeping at the intersection of the two. Again, that is not the sole purpose of art. I don't want to be misconstrued as suggesting that all art has to play that role. This is a reflection of my own experience. For better or worse, my list of occasions of unrestrained emotional response and the sense of doctrinal deepening that I feel accompanying those is strikingly short. Even more strikingly, they were all sparked by text, and even more strikingly, they all centered around narratives of parental sacrifice and filial love and/or familial alienation and loss. This realization of the relatively monochromatic chronicle of my sob sessions prompted me to look more carefully at my syllabus for a course that I teach regularly, lately every year, in Harvard College, a freshman seminar titled Faith and Fiction in American History. The freshman seminar program is a relatively new initiative at Harvard to give students a an introduction to something that moves the professor personally. I've had the opportunity to teach this 5 times now. The course is an effort to teach American religious history through novels, stretching from narratives about Puritan and Native interaction in early New England to stories about Muslim immigrants in the 21st century Midwest. As I recently reflected on the themes shared in these novels that constitute my reading list, I noticed that my fixations seem to be conspicuously on display. For instance, we begin with Catherine Sedgwick's novel Hope Leslie, a tale of a young Puritan woman and the family bonds that shape both her colonialist experience and the lives of the Native Americans with whom she builds intimate but complex kinds of connections. Themes of adoption and parenthood, familial trust, filial loyalty, death, drive this novel that was written in the 1820s, but is a reflection on the 17th century. We then move to Harriet Wilson's Our Nig, often cited as the first novel written by an African American. Wilson's semi-autobiographical narrative from the mid-19th century is a heart-rending tale of parent-child dynamics, both within and across racial categories, a strong indictment of racist sanctimonies, particularly of the Calvinist kind. It depicts an indentured adolescent girl trying to come to grips with a world in which her parents cannot protect her, and her race serves as a stumbling block to others who would and should be her guardians in her growing up years. From there, we roll through, depending on the syllabus iteration, Harriet Beecher Stowe's The Minister's Wooing, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, Rodolfo Anaya's Bless Me Ultima, Pearl Abraham's The Romance Reader, Chaim Potak's The Chosen, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, and Aya Akhtar's An American Dervish. In ways that I had not been conscious of at all when I constructed this syllabus, the novels that I thought best represented the religious history of the United States were almost all deeply connected to parent-child relationships and the quest of young people to make sense of and come to grips with the religion of the preceding generation. Not all my assigned novels hit these notes. I also, in reflecting on the syllabus, noticed that in the 3 that don't, Harold Frederick's The Damnation of Theron Ware, Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, and Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, all which happen to do with ministers of varying levels of sincerity. I now see that these handful of books that don't do much with filial relations or the quest to come of age are the exceptions that prove a rule. With those few exceptions, my course readings clearly had a dominant thematic orientation toward the religious lives of adolescents and the grown-ups who define their world, for better or worse. Now, maybe this syllabus was just a subconscious reflection of my own aesthetic preferences, but I promise you it was not a conscious effort. In constructing the syllabus, I was simply looking for the novels that best captured the key periods and elements of American religious history. But lo and behold, almost all of them were about children coming of age, inheriting both principles of faith and a fallen world that their predecessors had helped fall, and trying to forge their way forward. Was that me, or was that a reflection of the literary landscape itself? The way in which American literary artists have overwhelmingly chosen to tackle questions of belief on the American scene through the eyes of adolescents. Maybe a bit of both, but I'm increasingly convinced it's not just me. Hands down, my favorite book to teach in that class is James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, a story set only a few blocks from this very spot. The narrative itself unfolds in the course of one day, young John Grimes's 14th birthday in Harlem. But in the course of narrating that one 24-hour period, we get the whole history of heartache and intergenerational struggle. We learn about John's stepfather, Gabriel Grimes, who had been a preacher in the Jim Crow South before migrating north in search of a better life. We see the source of his rage at a violently racist country. We see his hopes and his hypocrisies and his hidden crimes, all of which drive Gabriel's growling disdain toward a young and hopeful John. We learn about John's mother, Elizabeth Grimes, who had loved John's father dearly before a biased legal system snuffed out the innocent life of yet another young black man, and she turned in some desperation to Gabriel. We learn about parents who have both loved and failed their children. We learn about children who find both empowerment and frustration in the faiths that their parents hand down. The novel builds to a crescendo when young John experiences his own moment of religious rebirth, Baldwin's vividly rendered sequence of John writhing on the floor of the family's Pentecostal church in agony for the darkness of his soul, with all the voices and images of his parents and the baggage that they have laid upon him, informing his wrestle with God. And then the glorious moment in which he is born again into a state of light and assurance, a state from which even his stepfather's ongoing antagonism cannot shake him, as in the final scene he stands on the Harlem street with a new day dawning. There's instruction here as well as affection, doctrines of grace and of the perseverance of the saints, and of the depravity of natural man, and of the inherent flaws in parenthood. Baldwin's book, by the way, is a pretty stunning example to me in support of an argument most notably made by Columbia's own scholar, Joseph Surratt, that the Harlem Renaissance tried to leave Christianity but could never quite make its escape. Baldwin's is such a powerful book for me, such a compelling narrative of coming of age on a landscape of faith, with all the angst and anger and hope and promise that such an adolescence can bring. It is distinct, but it is also representative of a robust tradition of American novels that have essayed to capture this same process. Another favorite is Anaya's Bless Me Ultima, seemingly set a world away on the borderlands of New Mexico, where a young Antonio struggles with the tensions between the settled agrarian ways of his mother's devoutly Catholic family and the more nomadic herding traditions of his father's hard-living relatives. And into that complex familial dynamic comes Ultima, the ancient native healer carrying the power of traditional folk practices. Tony is simultaneously pulled in the direction of Orthodox Catholicism, secular materialism, and folk magic as he yearns to understand his place in a world that is by turns stunningly miraculous and painfully prosaic. I received instruction as well as powerful aesthetic and emotional experience by watching young Tony navigate the borderlands, both literal and symbolic, on which he lives, including the borderlands between childhood and manhood. Why, one has to wonder, has the coming-of-age tale been such an irresistible genre for those grappling with the religious forces that have shaped the American experience? I cite here, particularly for me, evocative cover art from the last novel on my reading list, Ayad Akhtar's American Dervish, looking back while moving forward. Maybe it's because the story of faith is always one about the tense interplay of reverent inheritances and rebellious hopes. The great model for this is the Sermon on the Mount, which expresses profound appreciation for the law of Moses while also pointing the new generation to a better day. Certainly this is the story of the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in which a Christian heritage was inherited, honored, fulfilled, and turned on its head by the revolutionary doctrines of a new dispensation, brought by an adolescent prophet who, as Professor Bushman might explain to us, had a complex relationship to his fathers. Historians have argued for a long time about whether the New England Puritans were facing backward or forward. Were they looking to recover the lost legacy of primitive Christianity, or were they charging boldly into the light of a millennium future? Well, of course, they were doing both. Like the protagonists of these novels that most move me, the Christian journey has always been about what we inherit and where we go from here. There is a doctrinal significance in the stories that play on the heartstrings of our own remembered adolescence and our hopes for our own children. Through this art, for me, head and heart have become more fully integrated in navigating the difficult realities of intergenerational devotion. I think differently. I hope I act differently. I certainly feel differently. As a parent, as a priesthood leader, as a teacher, as I reflect on the generations that are coming up behind me. They have brought, these works of art have brought not only affectional deepening, but a new light on the doctrines of Malachi, and what it means for the hearts of the fathers to turn to the children. Indeed, not hearts only, but minds too. In these novels that I teach and love, and in the way I see my students respond to them, I see the unmistakable force of art's integrative power. In the time we've had tonight, I've only been able to scratch the surface of an interplay between art and religion. Certainly the American coming-of-age novel is but one star in a universe of creative possibilities. Other stars have been represented at this weekend's festival. But I hope I've conveyed my conviction of the profound, indeed I would argue the unique capacity of art to integrate doctrinal content, moral commitment, and emotional experience. And by extension, I hope there's an argument in there about the absolute necessity of a robust artistic culture within the Latter-day Saint community. We have our own powerful inheritances. We have our own irresistible hopes. And we have heads and hearts that need to be integrated in our service to those who come after